All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're exploring one of the most fascinating and, frankly, deeply consequential boundaries in human experience. We're talking about that incredibly fine line between severe mental illness and spiritual possession. For literally centuries, humanity has grappled with behaviors that just seem to completely defy natural explanation. So today, we're going to look at this mystery through two very different lenses, the spiritual and the medical. And we'll be looking at some real, documented case studies, both historical and modern, to really understand the profound stakes involved here.
So the big question we really need to figure out today is this. Where exactly do we draw the line between a spiritual crisis and a medical emergency? Think about it. When a person suddenly exhibits terrifying, totally unexplainable behaviors, how do the people around them decide whether to call a priest or a doctor? Because as you'll see, how those questions are answered can quite literally mean the difference between life and death.
Section 1. The Ancient Battle Unseen.
To really grasp this, let's start with the enduring human mystery of possession itself. It's a concept that has captivated cultures all over the globe for millennia. Across the world, various traditions have built these complex frameworks to understand what is happening when a person seems to completely lose their own identity and take on another. To get a sense of the spiritual perspective, just look at this quote from Dave Van Vickle, a Catholic exorcism assistant. He says, "When demons are allowed to take over a person, we would call that possession." Through this religious lens, you see, possession isn't viewed as a glitch in the brain. It's seen as a literal, unseen spiritual battle for a person's free will. It's a scenario where a demonic entity is actively seeking to dominate an individual. But how is that actually identified today?
Moving on to Section 2, defining demonic possession.
Now, it's really fascinating how strictly the Catholic Church actually defines a true possession. And they do this primarily to ensure that severe mental illness isn't accidentally mistaken for a spiritual attack. They actually look for 4 very specific criteria before they would ever proceed with a public authoritative exorcism. First, they look for preternatural physical ability. We're talking super strength or even levitation. Second, knowledge of unknown languages. Imagine someone suddenly speaking fluent ancient Greek without ever studying a day in their life. Third is clairvoyance, which is knowing hidden things they absolutely shouldn't know. And finally, an intense aversion to the sacred. This would look like a severe physical reaction to holy water or a crucifix. The Church only considers it a true possession if these highly specific signs are present.
Section 3. The Psychiatric Framework.
But if we flip the script and look through a scientific lens, we see a completely different vocabulary being used for these exact same behaviors. Modern medicine doesn't view these symptoms as the work of fallen angels, right? Instead, they're seen as severe disruptions happening within the physical human brain. In fact, psychiatry categorizes this under a very specific diagnosis: dissociative trance and possession disorder. According to the International Classification of Diseases, this is a state where a person temporarily loses their personal identity and full awareness of their surroundings. The affected person frequently changes their identity to that of another, altering their voice, their dialect, their entire behavior. So psychiatry defines these episodes as profound disruptions in consciousness, which are very often triggered by severe stress, trauma, or underlying neurological issues.
This right here, this perfectly hits the nail on the head. Looking at these frameworks side by side brilliantly illustrates the crux of the issue. Over on one side, the spiritual framework might identify an aversion to the sacred, like a patient screaming that holy soil burns their skin like fire. But look at the other side. The medical framework diagnoses that exact same literal event as sensory hallucinations, epileptic psychosis, and psychological triggers. It is the exact same human suffering, just interpreted through 2 entirely different opposing worldviews.
Which brings us to Section 4, the tragedy of Anneliese. To really understand the life or death stakes of this divide, we have to talk about a deeply tragic case from the 1970s involving a young German woman named Anneliese Michel. This timeline gives us a visual of the slow-motion tragedy of her life, and it shows exactly what happens when these 2 frameworks violently collide. It all started as a medical issue in 1968 with severe seizures. By 1970, she was taking anticonvulsion drugs and antipsychotics, but as the years dragged on, the medications just weren't improving her condition. By 1975, completely frustrated with the lack of medical progress and heavily influenced by the religious community, her family stopped consulting doctors entirely. They turned solely to the Church, which approved exorcism rites. And tragically, by 1976, she was dead. This timeline is a stark reminder of the fatal consequences that can happen when medical intervention is completely abandoned for spiritual rites.
So medically speaking, the community had diagnosed Anneliese with temporal lobe epilepsy and manic depression. But for Anneliese herself, her subjective, everyday experience was entirely spiritual and absolutely terrifying. She reported constantly seeing devil faces throughout the day and heard auditory hallucinations telling her she was damned. Her medical diagnoses clashed directly with her terrifying visions, and during the exorcisms, the priests actually claimed that demons identifying themselves as Lucifer, Judas, Nero, and Hitler were actively speaking through her.
And this brings us to a frankly staggering number, 67. Over the course of about 10 months, Anneliese endured 67 grueling exorcism sessions. Think about that for a second. Each session lasted up to 4 hours, happening 1 or 2 times every single week. During this intense period, totally driven by her terrifying delusions, she completely refused to eat any food, genuinely believing she needed to atone for the sins of others.
The physical cost was just absolutely devastating. When Anneliese passed away, she weighed a mere 66 pounds. Her knees were entirely broken from continuous genuflections during the rites, and she had contracted pneumonia. Following a massive investigation, the state prosecutor determined her death was entirely preventable. This ultimately led to highly publicized negligent homicide convictions for both her parents and the 2 priests involved. And it's safe to say, this case fundamentally altered how Germany approached exorcisms moving forward.
Section 5. A modern medical intervention.
Okay, let's fast forward to 2023 and look at how contemporary medicine handles a case that is startlingly similar. According to a recent medical report published in the Curious Journal of Medical Science, a 45-year-old Indian man arrived at an ER. He had a 5-year history of totally unexplained jerky movements, limb weakness, and severe memory problems. Now, both he and his family had come to firmly believe he was under the supernatural influence of a vengeful faith healer named Narayan.
His symptoms were incredibly complex. During his episodes, this man would completely alter his voice and facial expressions, literally embodying an elderly neighbor and then sometimes an unknown young girl. He even attempted to harm himself. But what's truly mind-blowing here is the shared psychological burden on the family. His wife and son actually experienced brief secondary auditory hallucinations themselves. They started hearing the same spirit. Because of the immense social stigma surrounding mental illness and their own deeply held cultural beliefs, the family actually hid these crucial details from doctors for 5 whole years, choosing to consult faith healers instead.
But here's where things take a totally different turn compared to the 1970s. Modern medicine stepped in, using consultation liaison psychiatry to carefully, methodically intervene. Step 1. Neurologists ran EEGs and MRIs to completely rule out any physical brain abnormalities. Once his brain was physically cleared, psychiatrists moved to Step 2 and diagnosed him with trance and possession disorder. But Step 3 is absolutely crucial. They didn't just hand him a pill and send him home. They provided psychoeducation to the entire family, teaching them how to manage behaviors without dismissing or insulting their cultural context. Finally, Step 4. A regimen of medications, including fluoxetine and sodium valproate, was introduced, which successfully managed the disorder.
Section 6. Navigating Mind and Belief.
When you put these 2 historical and modern cases right next to each other, the real-world importance of how society navigates belief systems is, well, it's impossible to ignore. Look at the stark contrast in these outcomes. On the left, we have Anneliese Michel. Medical treatment was entirely abandoned in favor of an exclusive spiritual framework, which tragically led to fatal malnutrition. On the right, the modern Indian patient received a culturally sensitive, integrated medical intervention. The doctors respected the family's immense stress, but they tackled the biological reality. And the result? The medical report notes he remained completely symptom-free for over 6 months.
I think this quote from the medical journal really says it all. The human cost of improper diagnosis and treatment is quite substantial. Misidentifying a severe psychiatric emergency has utterly devastating and sometimes totally irreversible consequences. And that's true whether it happens because someone ignores medical science or because doctors fail to understand and respect a patient's cultural beliefs.
So I want to leave you with something to chew on. When you look out at the world and see behaviors that completely defy easy explanation, how do your own cultural, religious, or scientific lenses shape what you see? It's a huge question, right? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next one.